The history of the world is, in many ways, the history of great cities. In ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, there was Ur, Memphis, and Thebes. In ancient Greece, there was Athens. Rome was a city that conquered most of the known world. The new Rome, Constantinople, was later built where Europe meets Asia, and was so well known that people as far away as Scandinavia referred to it as Miklagard, the Great City. And so it continues down to the present day. London, New York, Moscow, and Beijing have all been the center of great powers. Amongst these, though, an often overlooked city has a claim to occupying one of the greatest places of all in history: Alexandria, the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt. In 331 BC, in the midst of his lightning-quick campaign to conquer the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great ordered the foundation of a city on the western edge of the Nile Delta, where it meets the Mediterranean. It was here that one of his leading generals, Ptolemy, established his court when he became ruler of Egypt in the wars that followed Alexander's death, and in the century that followed, Alexandria became the greatest city in the world. The Mediterranean's leading scholars came here, drawn by the world's most brilliant library. Mathematicians and geographers calculated the circumference of the Earth with a fair degree of accuracy here. A steam engine would be developed, and one eccentric would even suggest that the Earth orbited the Sun instead of the other way around. Ships pulled in and out of the port every day, and Alexandria became the most populous city and greatest commercial center in the eastern Mediterranean. None of this would have been possible had it not been for the enlightened rule of the dynasty that Ptolemy founded in the aftermath of Alexander's death, and which ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. This is the story of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. By the time Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, the country's glory days seemed to be long gone. In the 19th century, as Egyptology was all the rage for European scholars and archaeologists, a certain Baron Christian Charles von Bunsen, a diplomat and scholar, suggested there were 3 golden ages of ancient Egypt: the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. The Old Kingdom was in the distant sands of time by the age of Ptolemy. It had played out between roughly 2700 BC and 2200 BC, and was the era in which the pyramids and the Sphinx had been built on the Giza Plateau that overlooks Cairo today. Then came the Middle Kingdom, as the 3rd millennium BC gave way to the 2nd. Arguably the greatest of all, though, was the New Kingdom that existed for several centuries in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. Its rulers were not pyramid builders. Instead, they built magnificent temples and erected huge obelisks and statues to honor themselves and the gods. Their empire also extended well beyond Egypt, south into Nubia, what we call Sudan today, west into Libya or Cyrenaica, and north into the Levant. However, what goes up must come down. And in the 12th and 11th centuries BC, Egypt had been assailed by a mysterious amphibious invader known as the Sea Peoples. They had not conquered Egypt, but they had weakened it. A dark age followed, known as the 3rd Intermediate Period in Egyptology today. The 3rd Intermediate Period saw the collapse of centralized kingship in Egypt. This lack of powerful government is what characterized each of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Intermediate Periods. The strong rulers of the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, ruling from great capitals at Memphis and Thebes, and overseeing immense building projects, gave way to weak rulers and a divided realm. For instance, for a period during the 3rd Intermediate Period, one dynasty ruled Upper Egypt, the southern, upland part of the country, from Thebes, while Lower Egypt had splintered into several small kingdoms, ruled by rival kings. Occasionally, there were rulers such as the pharaohs of the 22nd dynasty who managed to bring nearly all of Upper and Lower Egypt back under their rule, but in the main this was a period of disorder and decline. The high point of it came when the 25th dynasty claimed power in 744 BC, ruling down to 656 BC. This, though, was effectively a foreign dynasty, its rulers being from Nubia and keeping their capital at Napata in modern-day Sudan. This Nubian dynasty was thoroughly Egyptianized, and its rulers had become pyramid builders themselves, creating the impression that Egypt was still independent. Nobody could deny that what happened after the Nubian dynasty constituted an end to an independent Egypt. First, the country was conquered by the Neo-Assyrian Empire out of Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq during the reign of its most powerful ruler, Ashur-bani-pal. Then, a new native dynasty tried to fitfully resume Egypt's independence before a new power from the east, the Persians, swept westwards and conquered Anatolia, the Levant, and then Egypt around 525 BC. Egypt would remain mostly under Persian rule for the next 2 centuries, the precursor to the inception of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. The Persians moved on to try to conquer the hundreds of Greek city-states of the Aegean Sea and the Greek mainland thereafter. They invaded the Greek mainland twice in the early 5th century BC, but their armies and fleets were repelled on both occasions. Soon Persia began to decline, and by the start of the 4th century BC, the Greeks were leading expeditions into Turkey and further eastwards, which demonstrated that Persia was far from indestructible. If the hundreds of Greek city-states across Greece and the Mediterranean could be united, they would pose a major threat to the Persians and their rule over lands like Egypt. That is what happened during the middle of the 4th century BC. After periods of dominance of the southern Greek mainland by city-states like Athens, Sparta, and then Thebes from the middle of the 5th century BC onwards, each of them were weakened and a new northern power began to take control over vast parts of the Greek world. This was the Kingdom of Macedon, a state which the southern Greeks in cities like Athens considered to be inhabited by quasi-barbaric tribespeople. Whatever their level of civility might have been, there was no doubting their military prowess. By the time he died in 336 BC, King Philip II of Macedon had united most of Greece under his rule. Then his young son and heir, King Alexander III, commenced a campaign to conquer the Persian Empire in 334 BC. It met with bewildering success. By 332 BC, the Macedonians and their Greek subjects were in the Levant, and later that year they advanced into Egypt and reduced the country to their rule. Alexander ordered the construction of the city of Alexandria, and then headed off east again, conquering the remnants of the Persian Empire in the late 330s BC, before advancing into Central Asia and even northern India in the 320s BC. By the time he died in 323 BC, Alexander the Great ruled over most of the world that the Greeks knew of. Alexander's early death at just 32 years of age had created a problem. While he did have a legitimate male heir, Alexander IV, he was born a month after Alexander died, and it would not be possible for him to rule in his own right for many years. What would happen to Alexander's empire and places like Egypt within it in the interim? The answer soon began to reveal itself. Many of Alexander's leading companions and generals began to spread out to claim control over various parts of the empire. They initially did so claiming that they were ruling the various provinces and principalities on behalf of Alexander's infant son until he came of age. But Alexander IV was murdered in 309 BC when he was barely a teenager, and the pretense of acting altruistically to maintain the succession to Alexander the Great was abandoned in the years that followed. By then, many of the generals and companions of Alexander had been at war with each other to claim more and more territory and influence for years. These conflicts became known as the Wars of the Diadochi, a term which basically means the Wars of the Successors. They would last for 4 decades, down to the end of the 280s BC, and even after this, many of the successor Hellenistic kingdoms continued to wage war periodically on each other through the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Early on in the Wars of the Diadochi, a companion or general of Alexander the Great named Ptolemy claimed control of Egypt. He had been central to the immediate decision after Alexander's death to divide the empire up into regions that he and others would act as alleged custodians of until Alexander IV came of age. Through that agreement, Egypt was given over to Ptolemy. He quickly made his way there and began overseeing the building up of the city of Alexandria at the Nile Delta that Alexander had earlier ordered the construction of when he had conquered Egypt. Soon afterwards, he became involved in a squabble over where Alexander's remains should be buried. Ptolemy had the body intercepted in Syria while it was being transported westwards back to Macedon and brought it to Egypt. Initially, it was kept at the ancient Egyptian capital of Memphis, south of modern-day Cairo. Later, though, it was taken to Alexandria and laid in a formal royal tomb there. Alexander's remains stayed in Alexandria, and his tomb was a sight that drew many visitors to the city over the centuries. The tomb appears to have been destroyed in late antiquity as the Roman Empire was shaken by invasions and wars, and despite many efforts in modern times to locate it, no trace of Alexander's resting place has been found. While the tomb was being prepared in Alexandria, Ptolemy was solidifying his position in Egypt. He allied with several of the successors at various times and managed to claim control over Egypt, Cyrene, an ancient name for Libya, the island of Cyprus, and parts of the Levant. In 305 BC, as the other successors proclaimed themselves as kings and rulers of the territories under their control, Ptolemy did the same, becoming known as Ptolemy I Soter. Soter means saviour or deliverer. As such, the commencement of the Ptolemaic Dynasty could be said to be from 305 BC, although Ptolemy was actually in control of Egypt within a few months of Alexander's death in 323 BC. From the very inception of his rule in Egypt, Ptolemy I demonstrated that he was a very adept leader. This was not only in claiming a large part of Alexander's empire through his military campaigns. He also managed to quickly establish the legitimacy of the Ptolemaic dynasty to rule over Egypt. He was, after all, a Macedonian who had adopted Hellenic or Greek culture. To the Egyptians, he was a foreign ruler. Ptolemy was conscious of this from the beginning and established a template whereby the Ptolemaic dynasty presented themselves as half Hellenic or Greek and half Egyptian. Consider the satrap stele. This was an elaborate stone tablet of the kind that had been used for diplomatic treaties and as official boundary markers in Egypt for millennia. Ptolemy had this produced in 311 BC to commemorate his victory in a military clash at Gaza against several of the other successors. The text was in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and already Ptolemy was being depicted in the manner in which Egyptian pharaohs had been for thousands of years, wearing Egyptian dress and surrounded by Egyptian deities such as Horus, the god of the sky. This was how the Ptolemaic dynasty would proceed going forward. By the 290s BC, there was religious art and all manner of depictions of Ptolemy which intrinsically portrayed Ptolemy and his family members as Egyptianized Macedonians. They were a royal family with roots in Macedon, whose cultural background was Hellenic, but they expertly blended this with an adoption of Egypt's traditions and culture, presenting themselves as a semi-native royal house in a new kingdom that was part Greek and part Egyptian. Over time, the society they ruled would reflect this, with cultural osmosis occurring. Both groups absorbed elements of each other's religion and culture. Bilingualism in Greek and Egyptian would have become common, especially in the north around Alexandria. There is no clearer sign of this than the Rosetta Stone. This stone stele, containing a royal decree from 196 BC, was written in 2 different versions of Egyptian and in ancient Greek. It was the object which allowed Egyptologists in the early 19th century to decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, a testament to the hybrid culture and state that Ptolemy and his successors created over time in Egypt. Ptolemy was not only gifted with a keen mind that could see that he would have to adopt elements of Egyptian culture in order to appeal to the people of the country he sought to rule over. He was also blessed with military skill and long life. He is believed to have been born back around 369 BC or so. He lived down to his mid to late 80s, only dying in January 282 BC. This meant that he had 40 years in which to solidify his family's grip over Egypt and surrounding lands. Had he died in the late 4th century BC, in his late 60s, Egypt might have been claimed by another upstart amongst the Macedonian generals, as happened elsewhere in parts of Alexander's former empire. On top of living a long time to cement the Ptolemaic dynasty in place, Ptolemy waged a slew of successful wars. In particular, he allied with Seleucus, one of the successors who would eventually claim the largest share of all of Alexander's empire. Between them, they eliminated a host of rivals around West Asia before turning on each other. Thereafter, Ptolemaic-Seleucid rivalry would characterize the wars in the Levant and the far end of the eastern Mediterranean for over a century. Beyond this, Ptolemy engaged in building up Alexandria into a great city and commenced some truly ambitious cultural projects here. They typically only came to fruition during the reign of his son and heir, Ptolemy II. Ptolemy II had been king as a co-ruler alongside his aging father for many years before he became king in his own right in 282 BC. He is known today as Ptolemy II Philadelphus. There is a black irony to this. Philadelphus means sibling lover and was a reference to Ptolemy II marrying his own sister, Arsinoe. A decision which again points to the Ptolemaic dynasty adopting Egyptian customs in order to present themselves as de facto Egyptian rulers. Marrying one's sister wife was a long-established custom amongst Egyptian kings. However, Ptolemy II wasn't so friendly towards his other siblings. He had several brothers murdered to cement his control over the kingdom. This capacity for violence was mirrored in his endless wars too. In the entirety of his long reign down to 246 BC, there was barely a year that went by that Ptolemaic Egypt was not at war. A lot of this was comprised of the perennial border clashes in the Levant with the Seleucid Empire. The Cremonidian War between 267 BC and 261 BC was different. This broke out as many of the ancient Greek city-states of mainland Greece itself and the islands of the Aegean like Athens and Sparta banded together to try to break out from under Macedonian rule. They solicited the aid of Ptolemy II, and he provided it. Ptolemy dispatched a fleet and army under a leading general named Patroclus. He was ultimately defeated in a clash near Corinth at the mouth of the Peloponnese, and the Macedonians defeated the city-states before any further aid could be sent from Egypt. The war ended in defeat, yet it demonstrated the Ptolemaic kingdom's position as the strongest of the Hellenistic states that succeeded the empire of Alexander the Great, by the very fact that it was able to wage war this far away from its base in Egypt. During Ptolemy II's reign, a number of projects that had been either conceived of or actually begun by his father came to fruition in Alexandria. The most important, by far, was the Great Library of Alexandria. The scale of the Great Library has to be estimated. There were eventually several buildings that contained written works. Archaeologists and historians of ancient Alexandria do tend to concur that there was a primary library that stored much of the books and other written material. However, this was supplemented by other buildings that were actually primarily temples, emphasizing the manner in which government, religion, and scholarship overlapped here in the royal and cultural quarter. On top of this were ancillary buildings that acted as lecture halls and study spaces, and the Great Library acted as a kind of ancient university as well in Alexandria. This was not entirely unprecedented. The Ptolemaic royal family and their advisors were inspired by the Academy and the Lyceum that Plato and Aristotle had established in Athens in the early and mid-4th century BC. How the Great Library of Alexandria differed was in terms of its sheer scale. Ptolemy I, and in particular Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III, clearly must have provided a huge amount of financing to not just erect the buildings within the Great Library, but also to pay hundreds of scribes and scholars to copy out texts or to buy or otherwise collect them from abroad. Over time, tens of thousands of works were brought together in the Great Library, and it probably grew to hundreds of thousands of books, eventually primarily in scroll format. Nobody knows for sure how many scrolls might have been involved, though we do know that a now lost catalogue listing the library's contents produced by Callimachus of Cyrene in the mid-3rd century BC was said to have run to 120 scrolls. A 120-volume catalogue suggests a huge library already by about 250 BC. The Great Library drew the greatest scientists and scholars of the Greek world to Alexandria. It's possible that Euclid, the father of geometry, spent his later years in the city, although the evidence for this comes from Greek texts written hundreds of years later. Even if Euclid never worked in Alexandria, there was no shortage of great scholars who did. Take the example of Eratosthenes. He was a mathematician, geographer, astronomer, poet, and all-round Renaissance man before the term was ever invented. There were literary scholars here too in the 3rd century BC. The foremost was Apollonius of Rhodes, who composed the Argonautica, an epic poem centered on the tale of Jason and the Argonauts and the quest to find the Golden Fleece, a classic aspect of Greek mythology. In the sphere of medicine, Herophilos pioneered the scientific dissecting of bodies at Alexandria. The one thing the city did not become the center of was philosophy. Athens kept its crown in this regard, and the Stoics, Cynics, and Epicureans all based themselves out of that city rather than gravitating to Alexandria. Instead, the Ptolemaic capital became the greatest center of scientific inquiry in the ancient world. As the Great Library's growth indicates, the expansion of the city of Alexandria was truly remarkable. Where there had been nothing when Alexander the Great passed through Egypt, a half a century later, as Ptolemy II rose to the throne, it had become a major metropolis. It was not only a center of learning and government, trade expanded here too. In fact, so great was the growth of Alexandria as a center of commerce that Ptolemy I's government had undertaken plans to erect an enormous lighthouse that would guide ships in and out of the port. The site chosen for this project was the island of Pharos, lying 3/4 of a mile off the coast. It had already been connected to the mainland by the building of a giant causeway called the Heptastadion. This was central to the entire port, as the causeway and the island of Pharos, when combined with the coast of Alexandria, were used to form two semi-artificial harbours, the Great Harbour on the east side of the causeway and the Old Port on the west side. Around 290 BC, Ptolemy I employed the architect Sostratus of Cnidus to build a lighthouse at Pharos. The resulting edifice was so big that it was judged to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The building was around 110 meters high. We can't be 100% sure, as it is no longer around to measure it. It was built in 3 layers. At the top, there was a chamber which contained giant mirrors and pits for fires so that the sun's rays could be used to signal ships during the daytime and fires at night. Huge statues of Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, and his son Triton stood at the top of the lighthouse, while the lighthouse contained an array of storerooms as well. Unfortunately, we cannot know exactly what it looked like. It was gradually destroyed over the centuries, culminating in the Crete earthquake of 1303 AD, meaning that it and the mausoleum of Halicarnassus which also fell prey to earthquakes in the late medieval period, were the longest surviving of the Seven Wonders, other than the still-standing Great Pyramid of Giza. It was not all war under the Ptolemaic Dynasty. There was exploration and trade too. Most of it was of the kind that the Greeks had been carrying out all around the Mediterranean for centuries. However, there was a new component to it in Ptolemaic times. Egypt occupies a strategic geographical position. In an age before the Suez Canal and air travel, it was really the only part of the world that had access to both the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, and via the latter the Indian Ocean and the lands beyond. The dynasty was determined to exploit this position. From later writers like the 1st century BC geographer Strabo, we learn that Ptolemy I began sending out voyages of exploration around the Red Sea and further afield. The Greeks of that time were particularly anxious to discover the full extent of Arabia, a region which Alexander the Great had been planning to campaign into and conquer at the time of his death. It was also well known that a lot of valuable incense, like frankincense and myrrh, came out of the desert here, though the Greeks did not know that it ultimately came from what we now call Yemen. Ptolemy set about acquiring information about this region and the sea beyond. Soon, trade routes were being developed to many ports of Arabia and beyond into the Indian Ocean to India itself. It was under Ptolemy II that things really took off. That trade with India and other parts of the Indian Ocean and Arabia had hugely expanded is seen in the development and rapid expansion of two Red Sea ports, Berenike and Myos Hormos. Soon, goods and spices like cinnamon, gemstones, silk and jade, brought from India and lands beyond, began to arrive in bulk from the east. Ptolemaic rule transformed the trade routes between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Ptolemy II died early in 246 BC and was succeeded by his son Ptolemy III Euergetes, which means Ptolemy the Benefactor. He cemented the Ptolemaic dynasty's control over what we now call Libya, but which was then known as Cyrene or Cyrenaica. His father and grandfather had controlled Cyrenaica for much of their reigns. However, a revolt there had led to the emergence of a regional rival, which Ptolemy III nullified by marrying the ruling queen of the region, Berenice. Under his rule, a number of thriving port cities were established along the coast. One of these was named Berenice after the queen, and is the forerunner of the modern-day city of Benghazi. Early in his reign, Ptolemy III waged a lengthy war against the Seleucid Empire between 246 BC and 241 BC. It was very successful. He managed to claim control of the Levantine coast all the way north to the city of Antioch, extending Ptolemaic rule to its furthest extremity in the region. The constant wars with the Egyptian dynasty also caused the wider decline of the Seleucid Empire, which had acquired the greatest territorial landmass out of Alexander the Great's former empire, but which was rapidly losing its grip on Central Asia. The Parthian Empire, which emerged as the foremost power in this region for the next 400 years, is traditionally dated to 247 BC, when Arsaces I, the inaugural Parthian ruler, began conquering parts of Persia. Beyond his re-annexation of Cyrenaica through marriage and his conquests in the Levant, Ptolemy III is primarily known for building the Serapeum of Alexandria. This was a temple dedicated to Serapis, a syncretic Greco-Egyptian deity that the Ptolemaic kings were actively fostering the worship of as part of their efforts to create a dual Hellenistic and Egyptian culture. The Serapeum was built in the Museion, and it formed part of the Great Library of Alexandria, demonstrating again the overlap between religious and cultural buildings here. Ptolemy III ruled down to his death late in 222 BC. A power struggle followed in which his heir, Ptolemy IV, had several members of his extended family killed. The fourth ruler of the dynasty reigned until 204 BC. It was the beginning of the end of the golden age of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. Ptolemy IV was not a competent king like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. He was disinterested in ruling in his own right and handed over most of the day-to-day management of the kingdom's affairs to a group of courtiers who managed to inveigle their way into his good graces. One of these, for instance, an aristocrat named Agathocles, acquired huge influence on account of his sister being a mistress of the king. Weak rule and a king surrounded by sycophants and opportunists never ends well. By the later stages of the reign of Ptolemy IV, fresh wars with the Seleucid Empire had seen the dynasty lose land in the Levant, while a revolt broke out in Upper Egypt, which paradoxically is the southern region. It is named Upper Egypt on account of being more elevated. A native warlord named Horwennefer emerged as a rival ruler of Upper Egypt. This decline continued into the reign of Ptolemy IV's son and heir, Ptolemy V. He came to the throne in 204 BC as a child. Throughout the period that followed down to his death under suspicious circumstances in 180 BC, the situation continued to deteriorate. Indeed, each of the Hellenistic states that had succeeded the empire of Alexander the Great were in decline, and before long, new breakaway states were appearing elsewhere. The Maccabean revolt, for instance, in the 160s BC, would lead to the emergence of an independent Jewish kingdom in Judea for the first time since the destruction of the First Temple of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity over 4 centuries earlier. The Ptolemaic dynasty's golden age was in the 3rd century BC. By the time that the 2nd century BC dawned, the denizens of Alexandria would certainly have believed that they still lived in the greatest city in the world and were arguably the foremost power in the eastern Mediterranean. Still, everyone was aware that there was an emerging power to the west. Back when Alexander the Great had headed east to conquer the Persian Empire, people viewed the western Mediterranean as the backwater of the Greek world, a place where colonies had been established in Sicily and in places like southern France. Marseille, for instance, was initially founded as a Greek colony. Nevertheless, few people doubted that the eastern Mediterranean was the center of riches, military power and culture in the vast sea that stood at the heart of the known world. That was all changing around 200 BC. The city-state of Rome, which as recently as 390 BC had been plundered by the Celts, raiding south from the Alps into Italy, had entered into a series of conquests in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. First, they had brought central Italy under their control. Then they expanded to dominate the Greek colonies in southern Italy, something which first brought them into the worldview of the Greeks to the east. Then, in the course of 2 extended wars between 264 BC and 201 BC, they had defeated Carthage, a major power based out of North Africa, and had become the hegemonic power of the western Mediterranean in the process. Within months of the defeat of Carthage, the Romans were intervening in new ways in the eastern Mediterranean. Initially, they waged war on powers like the Kingdom of Macedon and the Seleucid Empire, and exacted large tribute from them. But over time, they began to acquire territory and establish Roman provinces and vassal client kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean. For every power in the region, including the Ptolemaic dynasty, it was an ominous development. Rome's rise and its expansion into the eastern Mediterranean could not have come at a worse time for the Ptolemaic dynasty. The family's fortunes had been declining since the death of Ptolemy III in 222 BC. Although they managed to reconquer parts of Upper Egypt eventually in the 2nd century BC, the family was descending into perpetual rivalry and civil war. The century following the death of Ptolemy V in 180 BC was marked by almost constant internal strife within the royal family. For most of the 2nd century BC, there were overlapping rulers. Initially, the rivalry was between Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII, both sons of Ptolemy V. To complicate matters further, a daughter of Ptolemy V, Queen Cleopatra II, became a force within this royal civil war and she ruled at various times over a 60-year period between 175 BC and 115 BC, as the sister wife of both Ptolemy VI and Ptolemy VIII on different occasions, as well as even briefly ruling for a time as queen in her own right, independent of either of her brothers. This is a truly peculiar situation. It means that she was married to Ptolemy VI, her brother, before his death in 145 BC, then later to her other brother, Ptolemy VIII, and also ruled independent of both. Additional confusion is created by the arrival of Cleopatra III onto the scene. This daughter of Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II became co-regent and later queen consort after marrying Ptolemy VIII. This meant that the man she married was her husband, uncle and former stepfather, having been previously married to her mother. Maybe it isn't too surprising to learn that another Ptolemy in the mix, Ptolemy VII, has genuinely confused historians. He is mentioned in the sources, but it is now believed that he never ruled by himself and probably died young. To say that the Ptolemaic dynasty had some problems as a family in the 2nd century BC would have been an understatement. In fact, the incest and strife might be interrelated. Severe inbreeding within a royal family like this is not simply something we would look socially askance at from the perspective of the 21st century. It is also perilous from a health and cognitive perspective. It can result in a plethora of health conditions over time, especially when incest is carried out from generation to generation, as was occurring by the 2nd century BC. This can produce everything from intellectual disabilities to physical abnormalities. There is no hard and fast rule. Theories have been proposed by historians of the era which claim that the members of the family were suffering from a variety of conditions by the 2nd century BC, and that these were partly the cause of the civil wars and the decline of the kingdom. Whether inbreeding was responsible or not for the decline in royal rule in Ptolemaic Egypt remains debatable. There is no denying how dramatic the decline was, though. After a century in which 3 very good rulers, Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II, and Ptolemy III, had built up Egypt to be the most powerful of the successor kingdoms to the empire of Alexander the Great, crisis and decline began from the late 3rd century BC. It never really fully recovered. On the death of Ptolemy VIII in 116 BC, his son, Ptolemy IX, began to rule alongside his mother, Cleopatra III. A period of unusual stability followed for 9 years before a fresh conflict broke out between mother and son. She managed to expel him from Egypt altogether and placed another of her sons on the throne as Ptolemy X. Meanwhile, Ptolemy IX took over the island of Cyprus, which had frequently been under Ptolemaic rule since the earliest days of the dynasty. He was consequently able to return triumphantly to Egypt from Cyprus nearly 20 years later to displace his brother from the throne and become king once again. When he died in 81 BC, he was succeeded by his daughter Berenice III, who was, in turn, assassinated the following year. Her murderer, Ptolemy XI, was lynched a few days later by a mob of angry Alexandrians, and Ptolemy XII assumed the throne. This often bewildering turnover of rulers was not just about power struggles. It also reflected some uncertainty about female rule in Ptolemaic Egypt. Often the stronger figures in these struggles for power were women, like Cleopatra II and Cleopatra III, who had to try to manage their weaker husbands, sons and uncles in a kingdom which was not completely opposed to female rule, but where clearly there remained a preference for a queen ruling alongside a king as a co-ruler. This partly contributed to the highly unstable politics of the Ptolemaic dynasty for over a century. Despite the deterioration of the political situation in Egypt as the 2nd century BC went on and into the 1st century BC, the cultural life of the capital remained resilient. Alexandria's golden age was clearly in the 3rd century BC, but it continued to produce great scholars and groundbreaking work in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC under Ptolemaic rule, albeit few of them are exactly household names today. An eminent scholar in this vein was Apollonius of Perga. He clearly moved to Alexandria and spent much of his adult life there, which stretched into the early 2nd century BC. A geometer and astronomer, he defined things like ellipses and parabola in ways that continue to inform science in the 21st century. The astronomer Hipparchus possibly spent time in Alexandria in the middle of the 2nd century BC. He was arguably the most important figure in the development of trigonometry, and also made important contributions to the ancient understanding of the equinoxes and the tides. Sosigenes was an astronomer who is also believed to have spent time in Alexandria, also in around 100 BC. His astronomical observations informed the later development of the Julian calendar by Julius Caesar's government, which is the basis of the modern Gregorian calendar. By the time the Ptolemaic dynasty was coming to an end, there were even scientists in Alexandria such as Hero, who developed working prototypes of devices such as a steam engine. They were only employed on a limited scale for creating theatrics in the city's temples. Steam engines would not be seen again for 1,700 years, when they formed the basis for the start of the Industrial Revolution. There was another reason as well for the instability of Egypt in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The politics of the Ptolemaic dynasty were constantly being interfered in from outside, specifically by the Romans. As far back as the middle of the 2nd century BC, Ptolemy VIII, in his rivalry with Ptolemy VI, had sought out the support of the Roman Republic. There was even a rumour in ancient times that he had tried to marry into the family of the hero of the Second Punic War, Scipio Africanus. For his part, Ptolemy VI tried to counterbalance this by maintaining relations with Cato the Elder, Scipio's great rival at Rome, who lived to be very old before he died in 149 BC. This foreshadowed Rome's growing interference in the affairs of the Ptolemaic dynasty and their dominions. The members of the royal family frequently brought trouble upon themselves. For instance, after Ptolemy IX had been removed from power and established himself as ruler of Cyprus, his brother and rival Ptolemy X sought out Rome's aid in trying to retake the island. Over time, this constant petitioning of the Romans began to turn Egypt into a vassal state. The events of 80 BC, in which Berenice III was murdered, followed quickly by Ptolemy XI, came about because Cornelius Sulla, who at the time had briefly become the dictator of the Roman Republic, imposed Ptolemy XI on Egypt, believing he would be a biddable vassal. Ultimately, his murder and the succession of Ptolemy XII only provided a brief respite. He was removed from power in a palace coup in 58 BC and immediately headed to Rome with his young daughter, the future Cleopatra VII, to petition for Roman aid. That was the same year Rome directly annexed Cyprus from the Ptolemies. Egypt did not have long left either. The final act of the Ptolemaic dynasty focuses on one individual, Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra of so many books, films, and even a play by William Shakespeare. Her father was soon restored to rule Egypt with Roman aid in 55 BC. 4 years later, he died, and she succeeded in conjunction with her brother, unsurprisingly named Ptolemy XIII in this instance. And, unsurprisingly, they married each other and then descended into civil war to claim power in Egypt for themselves and their faction of followers. In the conflict that followed, Egypt's fate and the fate of the Ptolemaic dynasty became entangled in the affairs of the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar, a demagogic politician and general who had conquered Gaul, modern-day France, in a staggeringly swift and brutal campaign in the 50s BC, crossed the Rubicon in north-central Italy in 49 BC and triggered a civil war against a conservative faction in the Roman Senate led by Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, a former supporter of Cleopatra's father during his visit to Rome nearly a decade earlier. The ensuing civil war was largely decided at the Battle of Pharsalus in August 48 BC. In this clash, Caesar won a crushing victory over Pompey's numerically superior army. Pompey fled across the Mediterranean to Egypt, hoping to regroup and gain support from the Ptolemaic Dynasty. Instead, he was murdered after landing on the coast. When Caesar arrived, he began an affair with Cleopatra, as she seduced him as part of her own campaign to defeat her brother and claim control over Egypt. Her plan was successful, and after Caesar left Egypt to organize his dictatorial government in Rome and clean up the loose ends of the civil war, Cleopatra was left in control of her native country. She also soon gave birth to Caesar's child, Caesarion. Everything seemed to be proceeding well for her. And then Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC, stabbed ferociously to death by a group of senators who were determined to save what remained of the Roman Republic. Despite the belated efforts of Caesar's assassins, there was no saving the Roman Republic. His death simply led to a fresh power struggle to claim absolute power. At first, several individuals appeared to be possible contenders to claim Caesar's mantle, but in the end it came down to a power struggle between two men, Octavian, the 20-year-old great-nephew of Caesar, and Mark Antony, a more seasoned Roman general who had become Caesar's right-hand man and enforcer in Gaul and then in Rome. Cleopatra bet on the older and more experienced general as the probable victor. Thus, by the late 40s BC, she and Antony were in a relationship. They had 3 children together, and Antony basically established Alexandria as the capital of his dominions, ruling over the eastern provinces of Rome, while Octavian controlled the west. All of this was a gamble, but had it worked, the Ptolemaic dynasty could well have ended up as one half of the imperial family of a Roman Empire ruled by Mark Antony. It was not to be. In 32 BC, Octavian convinced the Senate to go to war with Antony after he and Cleopatra had bestowed lavish royal titles on their children. The ensuing war was determined in a single massive naval battle at Actium, on the western coast of Greece on the 2nd of September 31 BC. Afterwards, Cleopatra and Antony fled back to Egypt. There he took his own life, and Cleopatra followed suit a week or so later in mid-August 30 BC, as Octavian's forces flooded into Egypt. With this, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end 275 years after Ptolemy I had first proclaimed himself as king of Egypt, and almost exactly 3 centuries after Alexander the Great had conquered the land of the Nile. With the defeat of Cleopatra and Antony, and the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt came under Roman rule. Only 3 years later, the Roman Republic also reached its terminal point when Octavian initiated a series of constitutional changes and adopted the name Imperator, Caesar Augustus. The word imperator is simplified today as emperor. There were some loose familial ends. Cleopatra had numerous children with both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Octavian had ordered the murder of Caesarion, his own cousin, 2 weeks after Cleopatra took her own life. Her 2 sons with Mark Antony died under unclear circumstances in the years that followed. However, their daughter, Cleopatra Selene, went on to marry King Juba II of Mauritania, a kingdom in North Africa approximate to where Algeria is today. Mauritania was a client kingdom of Rome, though partially independent. Her son from that marriage, named Ptolemy of Mauritania, succeeded Juba II in 20 AD and ruled this kingdom for 20 years. On his death in 40 AD, it was annexed by Rome. But for 2 decades in the 1st century AD, a scion of the Ptolemaic dynasty, through the female line, ruled over Mauritania. Meanwhile, under imperial rule, Egypt became a breadbasket of Rome. vast quantities of grain were produced along the course of the River Nile every year to be shipped westwards to Italy to feed the hungry masses of Rome and its hinterland. The incorporation of Egypt into the Roman state also gave the Romans access to the Red Sea. This had immediate tangible consequences. Within a few years, a Roman expedition had been sent down the coast of western Arabia. Trade flourished into the Indian Ocean. Before Augustus's reign was over, there was a Roman temple in honor of him in western India for visiting merchants, and an extensive trade was being developed all the way eastwards to China via Indian intermediaries. Basically, the Romans inherited and expanded the trade system that the Ptolemaic dynasty had built up in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Alexandria remained the intellectual center of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Greek-speaking world for centuries to come. Indeed, Rome never eclipsed it as a great center of science. If a person wanted to study geography, mathematics, astronomy, or physics in Roman imperial times, they went to Alexandria, not Rome. It was also the second largest city of the empire after Rome itself. Thus, the city the Ptolemaic dynasty built up retained its cultural and economic importance long after the family passed from the country and produced many great scholars in later times, notably the geographer Claudius Ptolemy, the Neoplatonic philosophers of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, and the female mathematician and astronomer Hypatia. Unfortunately, the rise of Christianity in the 4th century saw the city's pagan institutions come under attack, and the last major part of the great library, which by then was housed in the Serapeum that Ptolemy III had built in honor of Serapis, was destroyed in an orchestrated attack in 391 AD, encouraged by the Christian patriarch of the city, Theophilus. This brought to an end Alexandria's position as the greatest city of scientific study in the ancient world, 7 centuries after plans for the great library were first developed. In the end, Alexandria remained under Roman rule via the Byzantine Empire, with a few interruptions, until the 7th century, when the Arab Muslims who had burst out of Arabia just over a decade earlier conquered the city in 641 AD. Thereafter, the political and cultural center of gravity in Egypt began to shift away from the Ptolemaic capital southwards to Cairo. The Greek-speaking Greco-Roman culture that had begun here in Ptolemaic times was replaced by an Arabic-speaking Muslim culture. The Ptolemaic dynasty presided over one of the greatest eras of cultural development and knowledge acquisition in the ancient world from Egypt between the late 4th century BC and the late 1st century BC. What is remarkable about this is how completely unexpected it was. A visitor to Egypt in 350 BC would have scarcely believed that a century later the people of the land of the River Nile would be speaking Greek, discussing Greek philosophy, and congregating in a brand new city at the mouth of the Nile Delta, which had become the intellectual and scientific capital of the world. And yet, that's what happened. The country was conquered very easily by Alexander the Great in a matter of months in the middle of the war against the Persian Empire. After his death, less than a decade later, the country was claimed by Ptolemy I in the Wars of the Diadochi that led to the splitting up of Alexander's empire. From amongst the Hellenistic successor states that ensued from those wars, the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt was the most powerful. Its only rival from a military and political perspective was the Seleucid Empire that ruled over Syria, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia and Persia for a time. It was against the Seleucids that the Ptolemaic dynasty waged so many different wars in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, in order to acquire lands in the Levant and elsewhere around the Eastern Mediterranean. Wars aside, it will always be for Alexandria and the culture that developed there that the Ptolemaic kingdom is remembered. In the 3rd century BC, Ptolemy I, Ptolemy II, and Ptolemy III patronized the development of the extraordinary Library of Alexandria and the development of an intellectual and scientific community here that eclipsed even that of Athens in the time of Socrates and Plato. The scientific discoveries which were made here under the Ptolemaic Dynasty were, along with the achievements of the Arab scholars of Baghdad during the Arab Golden Age, the foremost to be made anywhere in the world prior to the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. While the dynasty will always be most famous for Queen Cleopatra VII and the manner in which the family met its ultimate demise during her reign, it is really this intellectual and cultural achievement that is the great legacy of the Ptolemaic dynasty. What do you think of Ptolemaic Egypt and the dynasty that ruled it? Was this the most successful of all the successor states to the empire of Alexander the Great? Or was its cultural power, as expressed through the Great Library and the Lighthouse at Pharos, at odds with its swift decline as a military power in the 2nd century BC? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.